In this video, I'll demonstrate how to utilize data binding within our applications. And I'll actually create two applications in one. The first form that I will build here in just a moment will give us the ability to scroll back and forth and view one record at a time within our data set. And then the other form will allow us to see a data grid where we can view all the records in our data set and even modify those records and save them back into the database. So let's go ahead and get started. This will be actually a fairly long video. As you can see, I've already started by creating a new project called Lesson 18, and the first thing that I'm going to do is create some controls on this form. So I'm going to pause the video right now and create about 9 controls, and we'll talk about each one of these controls we'll do. Okay, so I have created about 9 controls, 3 labels, 3 text boxes, and 3 buttons. And what this little form will let me do is go back and forth through each record in the customers table of the Northwind database. So what I'll want to do is display the company name, the contact name, and the contact's title, all fields from the database. So the Open button will allow us to open the connection to the database and retrieve the records, and the first record will be loaded automatically onto our form. Then we can use the Previous or Next buttons to navigate back and forth throughout that data set. Now, I've used the term data set accommodatively. A data set can contain multiple data tables. One data table at this point in your experience will roughly equate to one table in a database. And each of those data tables have data rows. Each data row roughly equates to one row in the database itself. So when I say I'm going to scroll through the data set, what I really mean is that I'm going to scroll through the retrieved rows that have been returned into the data table object of my data set from the original data source, our Access database. In the previous lesson, we looked at how to connect to the database and retrieve records into a data reader. That is a connected way of dealing with data in a database. We're going to work with a data set which allows us to essentially cache off or save off all of the data from the database that we need to work with into an object called a data set, which contains the same structure as the database, but it retains it in memory. It could also be persisted out to an XML file and then retrieved, and then at some later time resynced back up with the database. So we call that a disconnected way of working with data. The difference is very subtle, and at this point it's not very important, but just remember this, that the data set lends itself to data binding very well, so that's why we're using it in this lesson. So the first thing that we're going to do is work with the data set's best friend, and that is a data adapter. In this case, since we're working with an Access database, we'll choose the OLADB data adapter, and we'll drag and drop it onto our design surface, and when we do, we get the data adapter configuration wizard. This will walk us through the steps of configuring our data adapter. The first thing it wants to do is find out which data connection we're hoping to use, and we are going to use the Northwind database. Next, it asks, should we use SQL statements or stored procedures that I may already have. In this case, we're just going to use SQL statements. It's actually the only option that's enabled for using Access databases. Now it wants to know what data should we load into the data adapter, or to the data set rather. So I'm going to click this button here on the right hand side, which brings up the query builder, which we saw in the previous lesson. I'm going to select the customer table and click close. I'm going to select all customers, and then I'm going to choose OK. And then I'm going to click the Next button, and notice that it generated a number of statements. And we'll look at those statements as they appear, as they're created in SQL. These statements will allow us to grab the customer records from the database, insert new records into the customer table, update existing records in the customer table, or delete records from the customer table. Now, we won't take the time in this first example to go through all these, but these will definitely come into play in the next example. I'm going to go ahead and click the Finish button here. It asks if we should include the password. Since we're not even using passwords and this is the safest option anyway, I'm going to click Don't Include Password. And so now you can see that in our designer tray we have two new objects. The first is the OLEDB data adapter that I drag and dropped onto my design surface, and then the other one is a connection, an OLEDB connection. The data adapter is a very powerful object, and so let's take some time and investigate exactly what it does. In fact, I think what I'm going to do is make this a little bit larger so we can look at it in more detail. The first thing that we should take a look at within a data adapter is the fact that it actually consists of 4 commands. We don't see those command objects, OLEDB command objects, anywhere here in our designer tray, but they actually do exist. As you can see, I have the properties selected for my data adapter over here on the right hand side, and you can see that there is a select command, OLEDB select command 1, and if we scroll down to the bottom we see commands for delete, insert, and update. And if we expand each of these we can even see what they're connected to, for example, the OLEDB connection, the command text so I can see the entire SQL statement, and other information as well, such as parameters and so forth. And so when we went through that data adapter configuration wizard, it generated a lot of stuff for us behind the scenes, which allow us to interact with the database to select, update, insert, and delete records from the customer table. The very next thing that we need to do is to take our data adapter and from that generate a data set within our project. So I'm going to click on this little link here that appears underneath the Properties window called Generate Dataset, and it pops open the Generate Dataset dialog. I'm just going to leave all of the default selections, and I'm going to click OK. And when I do, notice that a new file has been added into my project called Dataset1. Let's go ahead and open that up and take a quick look at what this looks like. Remember that a data set is a representation in your project of what a table would look like in a database. So it's your own personal structure, the definition of columns and data types that will closely mirror what you have from the database. So what we're going to do is select all the customer records, and then we're going to put all those customer records in their appropriate places in this data set, specifically the customers data table of our Dataset1 dataset. So I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. Well, one other thing that we can do is take a look at the XML representation of a data set. This is the way that it's stored internally and used within ADO.net. But we don't have to work with it from this perspective. We can have a more visual view and work with the data visually. So I'm going to close this down for now. And really the next thing that we need to do at this point, we have almost everything in place. We need to be able to click our Open button and have it load records onto our form. So let's go ahead and double click the Open button so we can get into our code view, and I'm going to close some things up here so we don't have to look at everything. And the very first thing that I'm going to do is going to declare a private variable called Binding Manager Base, or BM, will be our instance of that object. And the Binding Manager Base has a unique responsibility, and that is to signal to all the controls on the form that a position change has occurred in a given data table, whether the current data row has gone backward or forward. So it's usually become a little more obvious in just a moment, but we'll use this in order to trigger the movement of the next record or the previous record, and have all of the text boxes that bind to this to this data table, have it represent the correct values for the new record that we're looking at. Again, it'll be a lot more obvious here in just a moment. So let's type some code out here. Well, the first thing that I need to do is actually go up to the top here and make sure I have so this all works correctly. Okay, now we're ready to go. Okay, this first line of code will use our data adapter to fill up our data set, specifically the customers table or data table within our data set with data from the database. So it's going to use the select command of the data adapter. It's going to run the SQL code that was generated automatically whenever we configured the data adapter just a moment ago. And then it's going to take those records and put them in the customers data table that we looked at when we viewed our dataset.xsd so that we can begin working with them, working with that data. Let's go on to the next line of code. I believe it's dataset capitalized. Obviously, customization is very important. You've probably gotten bitten by that a couple of times already when doing the exercises. What this line of code will do is get a reference to the current form's binding context. What it'll do is every form has a binding context, which is a binding manager base. And basically what we want is to return the specific binding manager base for our customers data table of our data set. So we could have multiple bindings going on, and if that's the case, then we would have multiple binding manager bases that we can bind to. In this case, we only have one, so we're getting a reference to that object. Now, this may not be completely obvious to you at this point exactly how the internals of that work, but I would refer you to other videos on LearnVisualStudio.net that go into a great bit of depth on this topic. So let's just accept for the fact for now that we need this line of code in order to navigate through our data table correctly on our form. So the final line of code I'm going to write here is I'm going to set the initial position to 0. So we want the first record to show up on our form. Now I'm going to run this application, and then I'm going to click Open, and you'll notice that nothing happens. Why is that? Well, the reason is because we have not designated which fields or which columns we're going to bind each of our text boxes to. So let's open up our Properties window. Let's even pin it down here. And so we'll select our first text box, and we're going to go down to Data Bindings. And for the text data binding, we're going to drill into our dataset 1.1 to the customer's data table, and then we're going to select the field that we want to bind to. We want to bind this text box to the company name field. So we'll repeat this for the contact name, and then also for the contact title. Okay, this is an important step. We have to tell the text boxes what piece of information are they responsible for displaying whenever the data binding starts. So now that we've done that, we can hit Run, and this time it should work. And it does. So here is the first record in the customers table. I'm going to go ahead and close this for now because we can't really do anything else with it at this point. The next thing we need to do is to get our Previous and Next buttons working. So I'm going to double click on Previous and double click on Next so that we get our event handlers, and then it becomes very easy to move the current record back and forth. We just go bm.position minus equal 1. So whatever the current position is, subtract 1 from it. And then what do you think I'll type here for the next button? Whoops, plus equal 1. And that's all I need to do to move back and forth. Now I have to be a little bit careful because I probably should put some more code to make sure that I'm not already on the first record, and if I am, then I would probably not make the BTN previous button enabled. I'd gray it out. And if I was on the last record, I wouldn't make BTN next available. If I do, I'll go past the bounds or the number of records within my data table, and that wouldn't be good. So at this point, it's probably pretty easy to break this application. So I don't encourage you to play around with it too much, but you get the basic idea. So we're going to click Open. I'm going to click the next button, next button, next button, and previous, previous, previous. And it seems to work. Now I'm just going to hit the previous button one more time and see if it blows up. Okay. So it does not throw an error or an exception. However, it won't work, and really we should be a little more careful in our coding to prevent potential problems like that from happening. Okay, so we've pretty much completed this first application. We saw how to configure the data adapter, how to create a data set. We saw how to bind the individual controls to columns of the data table, and then in code we saw how to fill a data set, a particular data table within a data set, with values from the database using the data adapter. We also found out how to do some data binding using the binding context of the form combined with our given data table for our data set, and then how to position the current record using the binding manager base. So now let's move on to a more complex example. The first thing that I'm going to do is add a new form, and I'm just going to leave it as form2.cs. Now in order to get this form to come up first, I'm going to have to change something in my C# project. You'll notice this static void main. I'm going to change this application.run line from form1 to form2. And then I'm going to test this real quick just to make sure that this works. Okay, now form2 comes up first as opposed to form1. So now we're working with form2. I'm going to go ahead and pin up the Solution Explorer too at this point. Now, what I'm about to show you might look a lot more complex, at least to an end user, but it's a lot easier and it enables a ton of functionality. And what I'm going to do is data bind a data grid onto our data set. And we'll be able to insert new records, delete or update existing records, and view all the records in a tabular fashion or grid-like fashion. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some controls onto our form, and I'm just going to pause the video right here while I do that. So I've added 3 controls onto my form. The first one is our data grid I've called DG Customers. Then I have a button to save the values that we change in that data grid back into the database, and then an open button that grabs the values initially from the database and puts them into our data set, which then will fill up our data grid. So what do I need to do first? What did we do in the previous project? We'll take the exact same steps. What I need to do is add a data adapter to this form. So I'm going to go Toolbox, go to the Data tab, and select the OLEDB data adapter and drag it onto the design surface. It brings up the data adapter configuration wizard. We'll go through this again very quickly this time. Okay. Notice that it creates our data adapter and our OLEDB connection. This time I'm going to generate the data set but I get a different dialog that pops open, or at least it's the same dialog but some different options. Since we already have a data set in this project, we have the existing option enabled here, allowing us to select an existing data set from a project. So I'm going to go ahead and select existing and leave all the other selections just about the same and click OK. And now we have data set 11, which again is a reference to the data set that we created in the previous example. Now I promised you that this would be a pretty easy process, so I'm going to just do 3 more things and we'll be ready to run. Here we're going to select the data grid, and I'm going to go to our data bindings, and I'm going to select data source, and here I can select just the data set 11 and then select the data member in a separate step, or it'll just allow me to select dataset11.customer. So this is our data set, and then this is the data table within our data set. So I'm just going to select this as a little bit of a shortcut. And now you can see as soon as I selected that the field names appeared within my data grid. So my data grid now, it has given me some visual confirmation that I have bound correctly to my data set. But if I were to run my application now, it really wouldn't do anything. I don't have the open button enabled. So let's go ahead and write some code for the open button. And do you remember how we got data from the database into our data set using our data adapter? Do you remember the name of the method? It was called fill. So here we go, OLEDB data adapter 1.fill, and we'll pass in dataset 11 for the name of the data set or our instance of the data set on this form, and then the name of the data table, customers. And that's all I need to do. I'm going to go ahead and save this, click Run, and click Open. And you can see it loads in all of the records here. So I have a nice little application that allows me to manage all the customers within my database. Let's do one more thing here, and that is to allow us to save changes back into the database. So I'm going to double-click the Save. And the beautiful thing about the data adapter is that it's just as easy to save information back into the database as it was to pull it out in the first place. Now, if you were a programmer a while back, something like this, or even a previous version of Visual Studio, if you were a C++ programmer or a Visual Basic programmer, you'll be amazed at how easy it is now to do this. That's all I need to do. I'm just going to call the update method, which will insert all the records that need to be inserted back into the database. It'll update all of the records that have changed back into the database, and it'll delete records that need to be deleted in the database. So all the changes that we make to the data are local to our computer or to our application until we hit our btn save button. At that point, it's going to call the update method, which will then commit all of our changes into the database. So I'm going to click Open. Then I'm going to change the company name to Bob's Shipping. And then I'm going to click Save. I'm going to close the application, and then to confirm the changes were made, I can do it one of two ways. I can rerun the application and click Open, and you can see my changes were made. Bob's Shipping. Or I could simply just go to my Server Explorer, and if I have either the professional or enterprise version, I can go through and open up and view it in this view. And you can see here in this first record, Bob's Shipping. So we covered a lot of ground and enabled a lot of functionality, and now you can see why using Visual Studio.net makes it a lot easier to write applications. We wrote just a few lines of code, but we were able to create a very fully featured application by just dragging and dropping objects to the designer surface or configuring objects using wizards and a lot of other techniques. Data binding is a great way to write visual applications quickly. However, in the next video, I'll show you how to manipulate data in a database when you're creating applications that don't have a visual interface, or when you're creating a more sophisticated professional application where you need more control over how your application works with data from a database. Also, we'll show you how to combine elements of object-oriented programming that we learned from previous lessons to create a more typical C# application. Thank you.